The charismatic former governor of California had always been something of an enigma to Nixon. Though friendly, the two weren't really friends. At this point in the relationship, Nixon's remarks about Reagan's gifts could sound almost like backhanded compliments. "Reagan can give a good speech," was a frequent comment to friends who sometimes weren't sure if it was genuine admiration of the former governor's oratorial skills or a way of saying he didn't have any substance. And the Watergate tapes revealed a 1972 conversation Nixon had had with Haldeman, in which the president suggested that Reagan was not pleasant to be around, and, without a trace of irony, called Reagan strange. Reagan, for his part, found Nixon odd. The naturally smiling man found it difficult to connect with the introverted Nixon. But by early 1980, Nixon began to warm up to the idea of Reagan. He had spoken to the candidate several times and told friends he was impressed. This was high praise, indicating that Nixon was impressed with Reagan's questions during their foreign policy talks, which were mainly monologues by Nixon. And if Nixon had worried that Reagan didn't have the gravitas for the job, the events in Iran were beginning to convince him that Reagan's decisiveness might be just what was needed in American foreign policy. Though Carter's public approval numbers eventually rose in the immediate aftermath of the hostage crisis, the public soon became concerned that the president had no strategy for ending the crisis. On ABC News, Ted Koppel began a new nightly program to cover the events in Iran. It was called Nightline, and every night the show reminded the American people that the crisis was nowhere near being resolved. In early 1980, Carter ordered a commando raid that ended in disaster. When Nixon was briefed about the mission by Defense Department staffers, he asked why more helicopters hadn't been used. "It's not like we don't have them," he said in a critical comment that was likely reported back to the White House. But Nixon's bigger concern was not the tactical failures of one operation, but the strategic failures of the entire administration. He was particularly worried that Carter had allowed the entire standoff to be focused on the hostages, thus empowering the Iranians. "I think that one of the major errors that President Carter made at the outset," the former president told Barbara Walters in an interview on ABC, "was to indicate that his primary, and in fact, it seemed to me his only concern at the beginning, was the lives and safety of the hostages. They are important, but the moment you do that, you are inviting blackmail. They know you'll pay any price in order to save those lives, and we could never do that." While the hostage crisis dragged, the Republican presidential primary was heating up. Though he maintained a public posture of neutrality during the 1980 Republican primary, behind the scenes, Nixon kept a close eye on two candidates in particular, John Connally and Ronald Reagan. His obsession with Connally stretched back nearly a decade to when he had recruited LBJ's close friend from Texas politics to join his administration. "Nixon loved strong men," Ken Kachigian later remembered. "That's why he stuck with John Mitchell for so long, and it's why he liked Connally so much." Connally was the exact opposite of Nixon. He liked shaking hands with voters, he exuded a natural charm, and he possessed major self-confidence. But the former Texas governor possessed something else: baggage. Scandal had plagued Connally for much of his career. Surprisingly, the one president brought down by a scandal seemed unconcerned about Connally's shady past. "He had a total blind spot when it came to Connally," Kachigian said. "I told him Connally couldn't get elected, but he thought he could." Still, Nixon kept his options open, and if Connally couldn't get the nomination, then perhaps Reagan could. "They weren't close personally at the time," Kachigian said, "but Nixon certainly appreciated his political ability." Reagan, like Connally, had many of the political attributes Nixon admired, but never possessed. His handsome face looked good on camera, and he maintained a steady air of confidence. Even if Nixon didn't think Reagan had the sharpest mind, he respected him as a formidable political talent. "He always said, 'I have a great mind, but Reagan has a great gut,'" remembered Ed Cox. Nixon's ambivalence about the upcoming 1980 election had been visible to his friends and associates well before the election season began. A former aide named Rob Odell had visited Nixon that spring and found him fixated on presidential politics and world affairs. Odell had worked on